First and foremost, the FIA is no longer applying TD39, the aerodynamic oscillation metric, to limit porpoising in F1 cars. Laurence, please explain.
Yeah, so I haven't actually done a lot of digging around this, but from what I understand is that that they're no longer measuring how much the cars porpoise, mainly because the cars aren't porpoising. There's nowhere near the issue that they had last year, and the main reason for that is that they changed the height of the floor and basically where the floor had to ride, and they did that in the regulations over the winter. So they've come into this year, and in fact, none of the cars are really struggling with this. But the way of measuring it, so the way of measuring the oscillation is still there. And if they feel that they need to be able to measure it again and potentially bring this technical directive back into force, they can do. So I think the big test of that will be Baku, which was the race where last year we had Lewis Hamilton struggling to get out of the car because his back was hurting so much. So if we get to a situation where it becomes dangerous again, all the reasons that we had this technical directive introduced in the first place, it will come back. But in the meantime, what's the point in monitoring something that's not really happening up and down the grid?
Fair enough. Max Verstappen and Checo Perez are separated by a whopping 1 point after Max claimed the fastest lap at Jeddah. What should we be on the lookout, Nate, from Red Bull this weekend?
Oh, I mean, how fast they disappear up the road, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think that we've had kind of a tiny glimpse of how things could play out at Red Bull in Saudi, kind of, with the back and forth over the fastest lap. And, is Checo happy? We had the great thing with Jos Verstappen, that great GIF, that great meme that came out from that. But I think ultimately what the season needs to see is Checo beating Max or fighting Max in a clean fight where Max hasn't started from 14th. And until we get that, it's quite difficult to jump on board this hype train of, it's Max v Checo now, because we've not got any evidence to suggest that is something that that we can see. So if Checo can kind of come away from a really impressive win, hit the ground running in Australia, a place where Red Bull have a crazy bad record here. Actually, they've won, I think it's one race in like the last 13 years or something at Melbourne, which is crazy when you think about how many times they've come into a season with a competitive car. So, a few things we could be on the lookout for, but ultimately, I think it's going to be more of the same from previous weekends. Maybe a few teams are closer, but that car just looks so far ahead in every known place we've been to so far.
Why is that, Laurence, that they haven't performed well in Melbourne and in Australia? I mean, some of it as of late has been reliability, I believe, but why would you say that in general?
Yes, it's a good question, actually. I mean, it's a very unusual track. It's basically
it's upside down for one thing.
It's upside down. Maybe that's it. Maybe they just haven't designed a car to work in the Southern Hemisphere. But no, my understanding of physics is that shouldn't make a massive difference. I think it's just a track where a lot of stuff happens. It's often at the start of the year, so you do have reliability issues. You have teams still trying to work out their cars. If we think back to this time last year and how dominant Ferrari looked, especially at this track, and then what happened later in the year, it's clear that it can be a complete outlier in terms of performance. So you do get this places. Monza is another one just because of the specific characteristics it requires from the car. Monaco is a very obvious one because it's unlike any other track on the calendar. So you do get these occasional tracks where teams just can't get it together. But, I think if you go back and you actually looked at every single race, there'd be bits of bad luck here. There'd be wrong setup decisions there, kind of stuff which is not a fundamental thing that means that Red Bull can't win in Australia. It's just that they haven't quite got it right completely every time they come in.
You mentioned Ferrari. Between Mercedes and Ferrari, who do you guys believe? Nate, I'll start with you. Who do you believe will have the better weekend?
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think I would back Mercedes at this point. I feel better about where they're at currently. But it's a really fascinating one because I think week to week that is a genuine question. But I would just give it to Mercedes.
Okay, then follow with George or Lewis has the better weekend.
I think George. I'd say George. I think he's in such a good groove at the moment. Lewis seems to be struggling a bit more. And yeah, Russell just seems really confident, doesn't he, with the car? He's in a good place. But I mean, I think when Lewis has everything together, I think he probably still has the edge on Russell. So a lot of it depends on how happy he feels with where the car's at. But if I was putting money on it, I'd say Russell, I think.
Laurence, between Mercedes and Ferrari, how do you feel?
In theory, I think it's a track that should suit the Ferrari more. But when you consider what we saw in Saudi Arabia and how much Ferrari struggled in the race, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's turned on its head. As I said earlier, we're learning about these cars all the time, as are the teams, and it seems like Mercedes made a much bigger gain between Bahrain and Saudi Arabia than Ferrari did in terms of just understanding the car. Again, mainly on George's side of the garage, but I think Lewis's side of the garage also understands where they made the mistakes. So yeah, I feel like the momentum is certainly with Mercedes, but the actual track layout, which is now, it's a pretty high-speed track, not least because these cars are so fast anyway. Like, you know, corners that used to be considered low to medium speed are now often considered medium to high speed, just because the cars have so much downforce. But also they changed the layout of this track last year and they added a lot more high-speed corners. So I think that should suit the Ferrari. And the guy I'm going to be looking out for is Leclerc, because I think he's going to have a huge points proof this weekend. Obviously, he retired from third place in Bahrain with the issue that then led to the grid penalty in Saudi Arabia, which put him on the back foot from the very start. But he was second fastest in qualifying. I know Max, you know, didn't make Q3, but he was second fastest in qualifying and not too far off Perez. So I think he's got a real point to prove, and I could see him making up the podium.
When it comes to Aston Martin, Nate, do we believe Alonso keeps his form and Stroll bounces back?
Yeah, I definitely think Alonso keeps his form. I think it's just a perfect combination there. That Aston's obviously very, very quick, and I think Alonso's getting the best out of it. And you know, maybe is, you know, dragging it into, maybe, you know, he's making it look even better than it has been. I do think that's a great car, but you know, how much of it, if Alonso wasn't driving, would there be? And for Stroll, I've been super impressed with Stroll. You know, he had obviously stepping in that first week with all the injuries he had was amazing. He had that great overtake on Sainz, I think it was, in opening laps of Jeddah. So he just looks really happy. He looks happier than we've ever seen him driving an F1 car. So I can see him being competitive again for sure. Whether depends what bounce back equates to with Stroll, but I think he seems good for, you know, to challenge for the top 6 at the moment every weekend, which, you know, is, if you look at the cars he's had in his career, he's never come into weekends with that certainty. So I can see him back up there.
Really quickly, McLaren has made some big changes. They announced the departure of technical director James Key as part of a team restructure. So the leadership, I believe, is now in the technical department. It's going to be split between 3 people. Yep. Nate, what can you tell us about that? And will it prove to be the right decision moving forward? Because obviously we know McLaren is a team that's struggling right now.
Yeah, really struggling. And I mean, this is probably, you know, if you were to kind of pick who the first kind of high profile, you know, sacking or departure would have been from a team a couple of months ago, you'd have said James Key. You know, he was kind of noticeably absent from the McLaren launch. Obviously, they missed all those development targets over the winter. And as you say, they're massively struggling in the first 2 races. It's interesting because McLaren have basically gone from having a committee approach, which they had kind of pre-2019, to a one-man or a technical department led by one man in James Key, and then back to a committee approach. So David Sanchez, who we mentioned last week, was I forget the exact title at Ferrari. He was head of vehicle performance. I think he's left. He'll be joining that 3-headed committee January 1st next year with Peter Prodromou and Neil Holdley. Now, I don't know much about Holdley, but Prodromou's been there for quite a while. And what's interesting is the impression you get from speaking to people at McLaren is that this is a long time coming. You know, it seems like it's a knee-jerk reaction to this season, but actually, you know, a lot of this stuff was going on behind the scenes last season. I think that the departure of Andreas Seidel to Sauber, which obviously is going to become the Audi project, I think actually weirdly has given Zak Brown a chance just to hit reset on the team. You know, he saw a chance to promote Andrea Stella, who'd been in a technical capacity before, and actually, sorry, this is going massively into the weeds of a few years ago, but the cars that McLaren really did well with coming out of COVID, so you had the 2020 car and then the 21 car, which obviously won at Monza and probably should have won in Sochi as well. You know, it was one poorly timed pit stop in the rain away from winning that race as well. Andrea Stella kind of kept the credit for those cars. You know, it was seen as cars that he'd worked on when he was part of that committee. And the James Key cars really were seen as 22 and then this year's car. And obviously McLaren have taken a huge step back last year, and they've taken probably a bigger step back this year in terms of this point in the year right now. So I think this has been going on for a while. I think Brown made contact with David Sanchez late last year and looked, he thought if I can get Stella in place there, I think they're bringing in one more person to be the kind of conduit between Stella and those 3 eventually. But now, I mean, McLaren, after this, there's no more excuses left really for Zak Brown on that team, because you know, you've changed the team boss again. You know, that was kind of forced on you because Seidel left. You've kind of reset the technical team. You've said, right, James Key's out. These guys are in. You've got the wind tunnel coming online now. So it does feel like the last kind of roll of the dice. And really, if this doesn't work now, the questions are, well, clearly there's bigger problems at McLaren than who's building the car, who's not, So interesting times at McLaren. And I think, again, Aston kind of making that big step they made has really ramped up the pressure on a team like McLaren. It was one thing I think we were all kind of questioning where they were at last year, but now in the context of what Aston's done, it's kind of even worse. So I think Zach Brown knows that as well. What was interesting was actually spoke to Zach Brown last week, and he said that even last year they noticed how much of a step Aston had made. Aston were kind of a bit anonymous in that midfield last year, but he said from the start of the year to the end, they were stunned at how much progress Aston had made, relative to where they'd been at the start of the season. When Brown looked across at McLaren's car, he said, well, we kind of started in a bad position. We recovered, but then we never improved from that point. So I think as soon as that happened, they realized change needs to happen. Yeah. A shame for James Key because, had a really good reputation coming to McLaren, but for whatever reason, just didn't work there for him. So be interesting to see if we see him end up anywhere else. But yeah, so, I mean, yeah, McLaren now, committee approach for them. Andrea Stella leading it. I mean, it is easy to lose track with McLaren. What's happening? There's been quite a lot of change, but hopefully, if you're a McLaren fan, this is the change that is the final one they need to make.
Oscar Piastri, though, in his hometown, racing in the Australian Grand Prix, which leads me to the best of the rest, which actually feels like a really mean category to ask you guys about, but alas, with the Red Bull where it's at. Best of the rest. Who do you feel like is going to have a great performance over the weekend? Valtteri Bottas, obviously. Laurence, you mentioned at the top of the show, living it up in Australia. Could we see Oscar Piastri do something crazy, even though Nate just laid out a very ominous picture?
Yeah, I think if you look at his performance in qualifying in Saudi Arabia, there's stuff there. And in Saudi, they were massively unlucky, and the Piastri had front wing damage, and then that took out Lando's damage to part of his car as well. So, there's enough performance there that they can be in and around the top 10, but they're up against Alpine, who, put in a good showing in Saudi Arabia. I think if you're going to pick 10 cars to finish in the top 10, you've got the now big four, which is Aston Martin plus Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull, and then you've got Alpine probably filling any point positions. But I'd back Bottas this weekend. He won here in 2019 dominantly, was really impressive. It kind of got to the point where everyone was like, wow, is this the year that Valtteri finally shines and comes and challenges Lewis's championship? He didn't, but he was very quick.
Yeah, I think that's as close as he got, I think, that year, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. And a bit of home, well, it's not home support, but he's almost made himself an Australian. He spent a lot of winter here. His girlfriend, as I mentioned earlier, is Australian, and the Australians love him and they love his mullet. So I could see it coming together and him getting in the top 10, and that will make it very hard for McLaren to get into the points too.
He's beloved everywhere, I think, honestly, at this point. Nate, who do you foresee shining in the best of the rest category?
Yeah, Bottas is a great shout, and if we're talking about best of the rest in terms of points, I'm going to back my man K-Mag. Looked good in Saudi, and this is a circuit I was looking at his record here. He's good. This is the place he got his only podium in Formula One, but he's always really good. And I think that Haas is it's a very up and down car, but yeah, I'm hoping he's in the mix as well. So should be a fun one. Melbourne always just has a few drivers that for whatever reason are on it from the very beginning of the weekend.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to get your picks. But first, I'm going to tell you where the standings are at. Nate is 1-0-1. Laurence is 0-1-1. And I'm going to get in on the action just 2 Grand Prix late, which is okay, because I think, honestly, with my picks,
you'll have caught us up in no time, Casey.
Overpass you two. Yes. So who started last time? I can't remember. Who wants to go first?
It was me. I got the first pick last time. So I think, Katie, if you're new to the game, I feel like you should go first.
That's hazing, but fine. Fair. I'll accept. I'm going to, because of all of the reasonings you laid out for the Ferrari to do well, I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc. Lots to prove. Max Verstappen, P2. Fernando Alonso, P3.
Nice.
Feel good about it? Yeah. Well, let's see. Nate.
So I think we might as well just give Fernando Alonso third place every week.
Okay.
I'm going to give him. I'll go in the proper order. So I'm going to say Yeah, I'm going to say Max, Charles, Fernando. So
Okay.
flipping your first two around.
Perfect.
But I think that's a pretty strong pick.
Laurence?
Yeah, so variation on theme, but I'm bringing Perez in. So I'm going to go Max to win, Sergio Perez second, and Leclerc third, because I talked up Ferrari earlier. I feel like I can't backtrack. But I've yet to put Alonso on the podium and be proved wrong every time. So you can.
Yeah, anyone listening to this must be like, "What's Alonso done to Lawrence? What's with the hate?"
Yeah, I know. I feel bad about it because I'm actually loving this storyline. It's fantastic seeing Alonso so competitive and Aston Martin up there. But I always feel like I just have to do something slightly different to Nate. So yeah, I'll bring Perez in the podium and Leclerc gets that third place because like you said, Katie, he's got something to prove this weekend.
Well, there's one thing I saw that actually should make me and Katie think twice about where we put Alonso is that every single driver that has ever surpassed 100 podiums and gone on beyond 101 podiums has the 101st time they've been on the podium, they've won the race. Alonso's 100th podium was obviously the last race. So I feel like, if history repeats itself, I think it's 6 drivers. I can't remember them off the top of my head. Yeah. I mean, it was on Reddit, so I didn't verify it beyond the graphic looked great. But often a lot of people on Reddit, they're pretty smart. So, but yeah, obviously, if that is true and Alonso wins this weekend,
we'll be kicking ourselves.
Yeah, or at the very least, it means next time Alonso's on the podium, he's on the top step, if history is to be believed. So, pretty cool stat, which I completely ignored as I made my prediction.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.